There is a particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't break dishes or slam doors. It doesn't show up in hospital charts or counseling notes. It arrives slowly, somewhere around month 4 or 5 after the funeral, when the casseroles stop coming and the neighbors stop calling, and the silence in the house becomes its own living thing. Liam Carter knew that silence well. It had been 3 years since he'd last heard Sarah laugh at something stupid on TV. 3 years since someone had moved his reading glasses off the kitchen counter and forgotten where they put them. 3 years since the house on Raleigh Street in Richmond, Virginia, smelled like anything other than sawdust and WD-40 and the faint trace of a boy growing up without his mother. He was 39 years old. He had 16 patents to his name. And every morning, he got up at 5:47 a.m., not because he set an alarm, but because his body had simply stopped knowing how to sleep past it. And he made 2 cups of coffee out of pure muscle memory before catching himself reaching for the second mug. He always poured it down the drain. Then he'd stand at the kitchen window for exactly as long as it took to drink his own cup, watching the light come up slow over the neighbor's oak tree. And then he'd go wake up Noah. Noah was 8. He had Sarah's eyes and Liam's stubbornness, and an absolute conviction that the best cereal was the one with the most artificial coloring. He made friends the way water makes its way downhill, naturally, inevitably, without effort. He was the most uncomplicated person Liam had ever known, and sometimes, at the end of a long day, Liam would sit at the edge of Noah's bed and watch him sleep and think, "You saved my life, and you have no idea." The contracting company was called Mercer & Sons, which was funny because there were no sons. Just Liam and a rotating crew of 3 guys who were reliable enough, and a bookkeeper named Donna, who scared everyone, including Liam. The company specialized in something most general contractors didn't bother with: accessibility renovation. Ramps that didn't look like afterthoughts. Bathrooms redesigned from the floor up so a wheelchair could navigate them without clipping the doorframe. Kitchens with lowered countertops that still managed to look like something out of an architecture magazine. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't the kind of work that got written up in Fast Company or featured in TED Talks. But it was careful. And it was honest. And it required a person to look at a space and think, who is this really for, and what do they actually need? Liam was very good at that question. He had been asking it in one form or another since he was 26 years old and a junior mechanical engineer at a company called Velocity Dynamics in Raleigh. That was the year he watched a colleague, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who had a PhD in biomechanics and the sharpest mind he'd ever encountered, struggle every single day with a manual wheelchair that was, by any objective measure, a piece of garbage. Heavy, difficult to maneuver, designed by people who had never spent a single hour in one. Liam had spent 7 months redesigning it, not as an official project, not with anyone's blessing. At night, at his kitchen table, on napkins and graph paper and eventually on proper CAD software, he built something different. A frame that distributed weight differently. A wheel lock mechanism that could be operated with one hand. Armrests at the precise angle that reduced shoulder strain by 31% over 4 hours of use, according to the small study he'd run with Dr. Osei's input and the participation of 11 volunteers. Velocity Dynamics had called it a hobby project. Then they'd called it promising. Then they'd quietly tried to buy it from him for a sum that would have been generous if the technology hadn't been worth considerably more. He'd said no. He'd filed the patents himself. Then he'd licensed the technology to 3 manufacturers at terms he'd spent 4 months negotiating with a lawyer he couldn't really afford. And the royalties had been enough, just barely enough, to start a small design studio with Sarah, who was an interior architect and the only person who had ever told him his ideas were good and meant it. That studio had produced 2 more wheelchair innovations: a smart home accessibility system that had been installed in over 4,000 homes by 2019, and Noah, who arrived in March of that year with Sarah's hair and an expression that suggested he found the entire world mildly suspicious. Then came the diagnosis, then the treatment, then the morning in November when Liam sat in a hospital room and held Sarah's hand and she said, "Promise me you'll let Noah be loud." He had promised. He had kept that promise. He had also quietly let everything else go. The studio, the design work, the patents that were still generating royalties he mostly forgot to check on. The version of himself that had believed innovation was a kind of optimism. He had picked up a contractor's license instead, and a hammer, and the careful, manageable work of fixing broken spaces for people who needed them fixed. That was enough. That was plenty. He had told himself this so many times that it had almost started to sound true. The fundraiser was held on the second Saturday in October at the Omni Jefferson Hotel, which was the kind of place that still had a chandelier in the lobby and a doorman who greeted guests by name. Richmond Children's Hospital hosted it every year. Black tie optional, donations required, past hors d'oeuvres and a silent auction featuring things like weekend packages at vineyard resorts and signed memorabilia from sports teams. Liam was there because Noah's third-grade teacher, Mrs. Calloway, had organized a table and needed one more adult and had caught Liam at pickup on a Thursday afternoon when he was operating on 4 hours of sleep and had apparently lost the ability to say no. He'd borrowed a jacket from his neighbor Dave. It was slightly too big in the shoulders. Noah was wearing a clip-on tie and the expression of a person attending a state funeral. "Can we leave at 8?" Noah said. It was not a question. 9, Liam said. 8:30. 8:45. Deal, Noah said, and stuck out his hand, and Liam shook it, because some negotiations were worth taking seriously. They moved through the room, Liam nodding at people he half recognized, Noah immediately attaching himself to 2 other kids near the dessert table. And that was when Liam saw it. Not her. Not at first. He saw the group first. 4 people clustered near the bar, talking in that way that people talk at events like this, loud enough to signal comfort, animated enough to signal importance. 2 men in suits, a woman in a green dress. And just at the edge of the circle, slightly but unmistakably outside it, a woman in a wheelchair. She was wearing a navy blazer and a white blouse, and her dark hair was pulled back at the neck. She had a glass of sparkling water in her hand, and she was watching the conversation happening 2 feet away from her, with the particular expression of someone who has learned to be patient without performing patience. The group shifted. One of the men stepped back without looking, his elbow nearly catching her shoulder. He didn't apologize. He didn't notice. The woman in the green dress glanced down briefly, the way you glance at a chair you've bumped into and then back up. The woman in the wheelchair didn't react. She took a small sip of her water. Her jaw was very still. Liam watched this for probably 5 seconds. Then he walked over. "Excuse me," he said. And then, because he hadn't thought further than that, "Is this seat taken?" He pointed at the empty chair beside her. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark brown, and there was something in them, a flicker quickly covered, that he couldn't name. "It's a fundraiser," she said. "They're all free." "Right." He sat down. "I'm Liam." She looked at him for a moment like she was deciding something. "Avery," she said. Noah materialized from nowhere with a plate containing 3 chocolate truffles and a small stack of crackers. He looked at Avery with the direct, unembarrassed curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to pretend he isn't looking. "Are those hand controls?" he asked, nodding at the wheelchair. "Noah," Liam said. "It's fine," Avery said. "Yes, they are." "How do they work?" She explained it. The lever system, the resistance settings, the way her specific model balanced speed and stability. And she explained it the way a person explains something they know completely and find genuinely interesting, not the way a person explains something they are tired of being asked. Noah listened with his mouth slightly open, the way he listened to things that actually mattered to him. "That's cool," he said finally. with the total conviction of an 8-year-old. Something shifted in Avery's expression. Not a smile exactly, something quieter. "Yeah," she said. "It is." They ended up sharing a table. Not the one Mrs. Calloway had organized, which was fine, because there were only so many conversations about property taxes a person could have. And they ate miniature crab cakes and listened to a speech from the hospital's chief of pediatrics. And Noah fell asleep against Liam's arm somewhere around 8:15, which meant Liam owed him 30 minutes. Avery and Liam talked. Not about much. About Richmond. She'd grown up in Charlotte, moved here for work. About the fundraiser. She served on the hospital's advisory board. About Noah, a little, which she asked about with the particular attention of someone without children who has nevertheless thought about them. And about his work, briefly, when she asked. "Accessibility renovations," she said. "Residential?" "Mostly, some light commercial." "Is there a lot of demand for that in Richmond?" "More than people think," he said. "Most houses weren't built for people who use mobility aids. They were built for one kind of body. You spend a lot of time correcting for assumptions." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "You do." He didn't ask what she meant. He already understood. When the event wound down, he lifted a sleeping Noah onto his shoulder and said goodbye. Avery said it was nice to meet him. He said the same. He walked out into the October air and drove home, and put Noah to bed and then sat in the kitchen for a long time in the dark. He didn't know her last name. He didn't know what she did for work. He had no reason to think he would see her again. But there had been something in that conversation, something he couldn't locate precisely, like a word you almost remember, that stayed with him in a way he noticed and then put down carefully, like something breakable. The email came 11 days later. Subject: Heritage Renovation Project, RFP, Response Review. It was from someone named Claire Nguyen, titled Executive Assistant to Avery Langston, CEO, Langston Hotels and Resorts. He Googled her name in the 3 minutes between reading the email and his phone ringing. The results were immediate. Forbes Incorporated. A profile from the Richmond Business Journal with a headline that read, "How Avery Langston Turned Her Family's Failing Hotel Chain into a $2.4 billion empire." A photograph of her at a ribbon cutting, navy blazer, dark hair, same expression he'd seen at the fundraiser, composed, precise, not quite a smile. He sat with his phone in his hand. CEO, 2.4 billion. He had sat down next to her and offered her a seat that was already free. He almost didn't call back. He called back. The project was the Langston Heritage, a historic property in downtown Richmond that had been acquired by Langston Hotels and Resorts 18 months ago and was currently in the planning phase for a full renovation. The ask was specific. The renovation had to include comprehensive accessibility integration, not as an accommodation, not as a checklist item, as a design principle. "We want it to be a property where accessibility isn't an afterthought," Claire explained on the phone. "Ms. Langston is very clear on that. Every public space, every room type, the bar, the restaurant, the event spaces." "That's a significant scope," Liam said. "Yes, that's why we're talking to you." He submitted the bid on a Tuesday. It was 43 pages. He spent the weekend before it was due at the kitchen table while Noah slept, cross-referencing the building's original 1924 architectural plans, which he'd requested from the city and which arrived as a PDF with a scan quality suggesting they'd been copied on a machine from 1987, with current ADA standards and his own specifications for materials and installation timelines. The estimate came in at $2.3 million over 18 months. He knew it was higher than what other contractors would quote. He included 12 pages of explanation for why. He got a call 2 weeks later. Avery Langston wanted to meet. They met at the Heritage on a Thursday morning. She arrived before him, which he hadn't expected. She was already inside, in the lobby, reviewing something on a tablet when he pushed through the door. She looked up. Something crossed her face. Recognition, and something else, recalibrated. "You submitted the bid," she said. "I did. I didn't put it together until the cover page. Mercer & Sons." She set the tablet down on the arm of the wheelchair. "I thought Mercer was a different person." "It's my middle name," he said. "My dad's name." She nodded once. "The bid is good. It's also the most expensive one we received. By about 18%, I'd guess." 14, she said. "I want you to walk me through the variants." They spent 4 hours in the building. It was a complicated space, beautiful bones, genuine history, 14-foot ceilings in the ballroom and original tile in the lobby bathrooms, but layered over with decades of renovation decisions that had each made sense in isolation, and together created a kind of navigational obstacle course. There were 3 steps where there should have been a ramp. There was a corridor that narrowed to 31 inches, 7 inches too narrow for most powered chairs, because someone in 1987 had added a wall that shouldn't exist. The elevator was original to a 1972 update and operated with a control panel that required reaching across the body to use. Liam walked her through every item, not as a recitation, as a problem. Here is what exists. Here is who it excludes. Here is how you fix it without destroying what makes the building worth preserving. She was quiet through most of it. She asked precise questions. She noticed things he pointed to before he finished pointing. At one point, in the narrow corridor, she stopped and looked at the wall that shouldn't exist. She put her hand flat against it. Just for a second. "How long does this take to remove?" she asked. 2 days, he said. "Maybe 3 if the electrical runs through it, which I think it does." "And after?" 42 inches. Enough for 2 chairs to pass each other. She took her hand off the wall. "Good," she said. They ended up in the ballroom at the end, sitting. Him on a folding chair someone had left near the stage, her beside him, with the afternoon light coming through the tall windows in long, pale rectangles on the floor. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Your bid mentions sensor-integrated door systems. The same specifications appear in a 2018 patent filed by a company called Reed Carter Design." She looked at him levelly. "That was your company." The floor was very quiet. "Yes," he said, "the patent is yours." "Mine and my wife's," he said. "She's the one who figured out the sensor calibration. I just built the housing." A pause. "I'm sorry," Avery said. "About your wife." He looked at the light on the floor. "She would have liked this building," he said. "It came out smaller than he intended." "What was her name?" "Sarah." Avery was quiet for a moment. Then, "The chair I use, the Apex series. It uses the load distribution frame from your 2017 patent." He looked at her. "I've been using it for 4 years," she said. "My physical therapist called it the best mechanical design she'd seen in the chair category in a decade." A beat. "I didn't know it was yours until 2 days ago." He didn't know what to say to that. He found he didn't need to say anything. The light moved on the floor. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past on the street. "I'll give you the contract," she said. "But I want weekly site reviews. I want to be in the room when decisions get made. And I want the corridor done first." "The corridor can be done in the first 3 weeks," he said. "Good." She offered her hand. He shook it. The first day of demolition, Noah asked if he could come watch. Liam said no, and then said yes, and spent the morning watching his sons stand near the sawhorses with noise-canceling headphones on and a look of profound satisfaction as a wall that shouldn't have existed came down in sections. The work had a rhythm. Early mornings at the site, Noah at school, evenings reviewing specs or on calls with the structural engineer, a meticulous woman named Dr. Yoon Park, who had the useful habit of being right about load-bearing walls. Avery appeared on site Wednesdays and Fridays without exception, and she looked at everything, not in the way that people look at things when they want to appear engaged, but in the way that someone looks when they are actually calculating. She caught a framing error in week 3 that would have added $6,000 and 2 weeks to the timeline. She did it quietly, showed it to Liam on a drawing, said, "I think this dimension is wrong." It was wrong. He fixed it. He started expecting her on Wednesdays, the way you expect a thing that has quietly become load-bearing. They found a rhythm, the three of them, because Noah was there on Wednesdays after school, doing homework on a folding table in the lobby while the crew worked around him, occasionally asking Avery questions about the hotel industry with the focused interest of someone taking notes. "Why do hotels put the shampoo in those tiny bottles?" he asked one Wednesday. "Cost management," she said, "and waste reduction, theoretically, though most of them end up in landfills." "That's dumb." "Yes," she said. "We switched to refillable dispensers in all our properties 2 years ago." Noah looked at her. "You own a lot of hotels?" 11, she said. 12 when this one opens." He processed this. "Are you rich?" "Noah," Liam said. "It's okay," Avery said. "Yes." "Does it feel weird?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Sometimes," she said. "It feels like a lot of responsibility." Noah nodded like this was a reasonable answer. He went back to his worksheet. Avery looked at Liam. Something in her expression was careful in a way it hadn't been before. He looked at his drawings. The name Russell Grant appeared in Liam's inbox on a Thursday evening in week 7. He was a board member, Langston Hotel's longest tenured director, appointed when Avery's father had still been running the company and who had, apparently, never fully adjusted to the transition. Claire, who had developed a habit of forwarding Liam things he needed to know, sent the email chain with a note that just said, "She'll tell you tomorrow." Wanted you to have context. The chain was 6 emails. The substance. Grant had commissioned an independent review of the Heritage renovation project, citing budget concerns. He had also, separately, obtained competing bids from 2 other contractors. The lower of the 2 was $1.8 million, $500,000 under Liam's estimate. Liam read it twice. Then he opened the attachment that contained the competing bids' technical specifications. He read those twice too. He called Dr. Park at 9:47 p.m. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she had also been awake. "Did Claire send you the spec attachment?" he asked. "She did," Dr. Park said. "I saw the same thing you saw." "The door sensor integration," he said. "Page 31, she said. "The calibration sequence. It's identical to the Reed-Carter 2018 patent, not similar. Identical." His hand on the phone was very still. "What do you need from me?" she said. "I need the original patent filing documentation. I need comparisons side by side. I need a declaration of specificity. The language has to be clear enough that a board member with no technical background can understand it in about 4 minutes. I'll have it to you by 6 a.m., she said. He was at his desk until 2 a.m., putting together the rest. Avery called at 7:15. "You saw the chain," she said. It was not a question. "I did." A pause on the line. "I wanted to tell you in person." "I know." He paused. "Avery, the competing bid uses my patented technology without licensing it." Silence. "Are you certain?" she said. Dr. Park confirmed it independently. "I have the documentation." Another silence. Longer. He heard her breath, very even, the way breathing is even when someone is choosing to make it that way. "Russell knows this," she said quietly. It was not a question either. If he reviewed the specs with anyone competent, yes. So he's not just trying to underbid us, he's... She stopped. "He's using a contractor who infringed on the patents to create an alternative that gets board approval," Liam said. Once the contract is awarded, the infringement is embedded in the project. It becomes complicated to unwind. A very long pause. "Can you be at the board meeting Monday morning?" she said. "Yes." "Bring Dr. Park." "Already planned." The smallest pause. "Liam." "Yeah." "Thank you." He didn't answer immediately. Outside, a car passed on Raleigh Street. Inside, the house was very quiet. "Monday," he said. The Langston Hotels and Resorts boardroom was on the 14th floor of a building on East Main Street, with views of the James River and the kind of silence that costs money to maintain. There were 9 people around the table. Russell Grant was at the far end, a man in his mid-60s, silver hair, the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades being the most powerful person in whatever room he enters. He looked at Liam when Liam walked in. His expression didn't change. Avery was already seated. She didn't look at Grant. She looked at the table in front of her, and her hands were flat on the surface, and the stillness in her was different from Grant's stillness. It wasn't ease. It was containment, and it cost her something. Liam set up his materials. Dr. Park sat beside him. She had brought a printed report and also a presentation, and she had the manner of someone who had testified before more difficult rooms than this one. The presentation took 11 minutes. Dr. Park walked through the patents, the filing dates, the specific technical specifications that appeared in the competing bid, line by line, the licensing requirements, the legal exposure the board would be accepting if they approved a contract built on technology they had no right to use. The room was very quiet. Grant spoke once in the middle to say that the similarities might be coincidental, that standard industry specifications often converged. Dr. Park looked at him over her glasses. "The calibration sequence on page 31 is not a standard industry specification," she said. "It is a specific innovation filed in October 2018 with the USPTO, assigned filing number 16/152847. The probability of independent convergence on this precise sequence is approximately," she checked her notes, "negligible." Grant was quiet after that. The vote was 7-2. Avery kept the project. The competing bid was referred to legal. After the board members filed out, Liam sat for a moment while Avery spoke quietly with her general counsel. He looked out at the river. The water was flat and silver in the morning light. Noah had a math test today. He had forgotten to remind him to bring a pencil with an eraser. He hoped he remembered. She found him outside in the small plaza in front of the building, standing in the October air with his jacket over his arm. "You didn't have to stay," she said. "I know." She came to a stop beside him. They both looked at the river, visible between the buildings at the end of the block. "He'll resign," she said, "or we'll force it. Either way." "I know." "You could have licensed those patents years ago," she said. "You probably could have won a significant infringement case before today. You must have known people were using your work." He was quiet for a moment. "There was a while," he said slowly, "when I wasn't really paying attention to any of it. And then by the time I was, it felt like something from a different life, not mine to protect anymore." She was quiet too. "It was always yours," she said. Something in his chest shifted, not dramatically, quietly, like a door that has been stuck for a long time, moving an inch. "Sarah would have had lawsuits filed the first week," he said, and for the first time in a long time, the way he said her name didn't sound like an ending. Avery made a small sound, almost a laugh. "She sounds like someone I would have liked," she said. "You would have," he said. She was relentless. They stood there for a while. A bus went past. A woman walked a dog. The city went about its business around them, indifferent and continuous. "Noah asked me last week," Avery said, "whether I would come to his school's career day." Liam looked at her. "He wants me to talk about hotels," she said. "I think what he actually wants is for me to tell his class that he's been helping with a real renovation project, which, A pause. Is an exaggeration, but not by much. Liam laughed. It came out fuller than he expected. He's been feeding you material, he said. Constantly, she said. A pause, comfortable and unhurried. You should come, he said. To career day. She looked at him. Her expression was careful again, that particular carefulness he'd come to recognize as the place where she kept the things that mattered. Okay, she said. The Heritage reopened on the second Saturday in April. Liam stood at the edge of the lobby as the first guests came through the door. The corridor was 44 inches wide, 2 more than required. The elevator had a control panel you could operate without reaching. The ballroom floor was seamless between the entrance and the dance floor, no threshold, no lip, nothing to catch a wheel or a walker or a cane. The bathrooms had turning radius and grab bars that had been designed with a physical therapist and looked, somehow, like they had always been there. The front desk was at a height where you could check in whether you were standing or seated, and the desk clerk made eye contact with you either way. Avery had been there every day of the final 2 weeks. She had noticed, on the second-to-last day, that one of the guest room doors had a threshold that was 2 millimeters too high. 2 millimeters. She had shown it to Liam on her phone's camera without saying anything, just turned the screen toward him. He'd had it fixed by noon. Now she was across the lobby, speaking with the mayor and 2 city council members, and she was very composed and precise, and occasionally gesturing toward the architectural details with the manner of someone who had thought about each one. Noah was standing next to Liam, eating a miniature quiche. Is Avery going to be our family? He asked. Liam looked at him. I mean, Noah said, she's here a lot. She's a client, Liam said. Noah considered this with the expression of someone reviewing insufficient evidence. She came to career day, he said. Clients don't do that. Some do. She fixed my book report. She gave you notes on your book report. That's different. Dad. He looked at his son. Noah was looking back at him with Sarah's eyes, steady and patient and completely unwilling to pretend not to see a thing he saw. Liam looked back across the lobby. Avery was laughing at something the mayor had said. A real laugh, the kind that she didn't produce for an audience, the kind he'd seen maybe 4 times in 5 months of working together, and each time it landed somewhere in him that he'd stopped noticing was there. His throat was tight. I don't know, he said honestly. Noah nodded. Okay, he said, and took another quiche. After the guests had been received and the speeches given and the local news crew had finished their segment, Avery found Liam in the ballroom. He was standing near the window where they had sat 6 months ago, in the empty building, in the afternoon light. She came to a stop beside him. It's good, she said. It is. The corridor especially. The corridor was first, he said. They looked at the room. It was full now, people talking and laughing, a quartet playing near the stage, light catching on the glasses and the chandeliers and the pale marble floors. I want to talk to you about something, she said. The foundation. He looked at her. I've been in conversations with the hospital, the Children's Hospital, about an accessibility design fellowship for young engineers, early career people who want to work in adaptive design. A pause. I want to name it. I was thinking the Reed Carter Fellowship. His throat closed. Sarah, he said, and you, both of you. The work is both of yours. She was looking at him steadily. It's not charity. It's attribution. The technology that's helped people, including me, deserves to have names attached to it. Real names, not just patent numbers. He looked at the room. He thought about Sarah at the kitchen table in Raleigh with graph papers spread out, saying, what if the sensor doesn't need to be on the chair? What if the door already knows? He thought about Noah asleep against his shoulder at the fundraiser 6 months ago. The October air outside. the specific quality of coincidence that doesn't feel later like coincidence. "Yes," he said. The word came out steady. A Saturday morning, 2nd October. The kitchen on Raleigh Street smelled like coffee and Noah's brand of aggressively colored cereal, and something baking, because Avery had recently decided she wanted to learn to make biscuits and had approached this project with the same systematic focus she brought to renovation plans and board presentations. The first batch had been, in her own words, architecturally unsound. The third batch was on the counter now, cooling. Noah was at the kitchen table, working on something that was either a school project or a detailed plan for rearranging the garage. Liam couldn't quite tell. He was describing, to no one in particular, a theory he had about why cereal boxes were the wrong shape. Avery was at the counter, reading something on her phone, occasionally making a sound of agreement or skepticism at whatever Noah was saying. Liam stood at the kitchen window with his coffee. The light was coming up over the neighbor's oak tree, long and pale and unhurried. He was not thinking about the second cup. He was thinking about the biscuits on the counter and the sound of Noah's voice and the particular way Avery turned a page, or scrolled rather, but the gesture was the same, a certain deliberateness, and the way this morning felt like mornings were supposed to feel, and almost never did. He was not thinking about the version of himself who had stood here 3 years ago in the dark. He wasn't not thinking about it either. He thought, you don't stop carrying what you've lost. You just, eventually, have more to carry. And the weight distributes differently. And some mornings you stand at a window and the light comes up, and everything that is broken and everything that was saved is present at the same time, and it is not a contradiction. It is just a life. "The biscuits smell good," he said. "They should," Avery said without looking up. "I made them correctly this time." "Third time," Noah said. "Third time is sufficient," she said. Noah laughed. Liam laughed. Outside the light kept coming. Nobody had been looking for this. Not the contract, not the corridor, not the October morning at a fundraiser when a man sat down next to a woman at a table that was already free. Not the three of them in a kitchen on a Saturday with bad cereal and possibly good biscuits, and the slow, unannounced arrival of a life that fit. Nobody had planned it. But somewhere, Liam thought, in the careful geometry of what we build for other people, in the steady, patient work of designing spaces where everyone belongs, somewhere in that, they had built their way here. And here was enough. Here was everything. If this story stayed with you, the quiet kindness, the work that goes unnoticed, the love that nobody saw coming, drop a word in the comments. We read every single one. If stories like this mean something to you, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story we share is about the quiet, human moments that remind us what actually matters. And your support is what makes the next one possible. Thank you for being here. Truly. This story follows Marcus Webb, a brilliant black toxicologist whose life was destroyed after he tried to expose dangerous research misconduct at a pharmaceutical institute. Once respected as Dr. Marcus Webb, he lost everything: his career, reputation, home, and marriage, after powerful people discredited his findings. Years later, he works quietly as a hospital janitor, while raising his 7-year-old daughter, Maya, in a small but carefully organized apartment. Though the world now sees him as invisible, Marcus never stopped being a scientist. At the same hospital, 9-year-old Chloe Sterling, daughter of powerful CEO Eleanor Sterling, lies unconscious with a mysterious illness no doctor can explain. 18 specialists have failed to find a diagnosis. Eleanor, a woman used to controlling every outcome through power and money, watches helplessly as her daughter fades away. While cleaning the hospital at night, Marcus notices something strange outside Chloe's room: the faint chemical scent of DMSO, a compound he recognizes instantly from his toxicology background. His instincts tell him something is terribly wrong. Quietly, he begins observing patterns, documenting dates, tracking medical staff rotations, and recording chemical traces in a notebook. The evidence points toward a horrifying possibility. Someone is poisoning Chloe. The more Marcus investigates, the more suspicion centers around Dr. Thorne, Chloe's trusted physician. Thorne appears compassionate, ethical, and devoted, exactly the kind of man no one would question. But Marcus discovers a disturbing connection between Thorne's hospital shifts and Chloe's worsening condition. Behind the scenes, Thorne is secretly involved in a financial conspiracy tied to Sterling Corp's stock manipulation, where Chloe's death would trigger massive profits through a carefully timed short sale. Marcus desperately tries to warn Eleanor, but his past and appearance work against him. His PTSD causes his explanation to come out fragmented, and Eleanor sees only an unstable janitor approaching her daughter's room. Security removes him, and he is fired from the hospital for suspicious behavior. Most people would stop there. Marcus does not. Working from a makeshift laboratory beneath his apartment, he uses his remaining scientific skills to create a diagnostic reagent capable of exposing the toxin. Knowing time is running out, he risks everything by returning to the hospital one final night. Inside Chloe's room, Marcus interrupts Thorne just as the doctor prepares another injection. Security tackles Marcus, and once again he looks like the villain. But before being restrained, he asks Eleanor to take a blue vial from his jacket and test the liquid Thorne dropped. She hesitates, torn between the trusted doctor and the disgraced janitor. Then she remembers the look Marcus gave her days earlier, not threatening, but urgent. A look of someone trying to stop something terrible. She trusts him. The moment the reagent touches the liquid, it turns deep purple-black, undeniable proof of poisoning. The truth finally surfaces. Police discover financial records and evidence of a massive conspiracy involving Thorne and an investment group seeking profit from Eleanor's tragedy. Chloe survives. The toxin is identified, treatment begins, and her recovery slowly starts. But the greatest healing happens outside the ICU. Eleanor realizes how easily she judged Marcus based on fear, status, and appearances. Instead of offering money or empty apologies, she visits his apartment and begins again, not with power, but with honesty. The story closes with hope. Marcus is restored to the scientific world as director of toxicology at Sterling Corp's new research lab. Yet he keeps his old custodial badge beside his new ID card, a reminder of who he was, what he survived, and the price of being ignored. Nearby sits a photograph of Chloe and Maya laughing together, proof that compassion can bridge worlds adults often divide. This story reminds us that truth does not become less true simply because the wrong person speaks it. Marcus lost credibility in society's eyes, but his knowledge, integrity, and purpose never disappeared. Sometimes the world dismisses people not because they are wrong, but because listening to them is inconvenient. The story also shows that appearances can be dangerously misleading. Dr. Thorne looked trustworthy, while Marcus looked suspicious. Yet goodness and evil rarely announce themselves clearly. Real judgment requires patience and humility. Another powerful lesson is that expertise and identity are not the same as social status. Marcus remained a scientist even while pushing a cleaning cart. Titles may disappear, but skill, character, and conviction endure. Finally, the story teaches that redemption and trust are possible. Eleanor learns to dismantle her assumptions, Marcus reclaims his place in the world, and Chloe's survival becomes more than a medical victory. It becomes proof that believing in the overlooked can save lives. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more emotional stories about resilience, justice, and second chances. And tell us in the comments, would you have trusted Marcus in that hospital room? Sometimes one decision changes everything, and your answer might reveal more than you think.